Bueno, bienvenidos a esta reunión tan especial de la Fundación Alem, del Comité en Derechos Humanos. Es para mí un placer y un honor presentarles al profesor Farrer y también al profesor Marcelo Alegre, de la Facultad de Derecho de la Universidad de Buenos Aires, que actualmente está a cargo de dirigir el Instituto de Investigaciones Gioja y que va a entrevistar y a dialogar con el profesor Farrer. Decía que presentar al profesor Farrer es personalmente un placer, porque fui alumna de Farrer en los años 90 en American University, y su curso fue un desafío intelectual, y hasta el día de hoy es una guía en la manera en que yo abordo, pienso y enseño Derecho Internacional Público en la Universidad de Buenos Aires. Pero también es un honor. Es un honor porque cualquiera que haya seguido su trayectoria y haya leído alguna de sus piezas puede darse cuenta de su enorme conocimiento, habilidad y también integridad para transitar con los instrumentos legales en mano, con el derecho en la mano, los desafíos éticos y políticos que la defensa de los derechos humanos plantea. Tom Farrer es hoy profesor de la Universidad de Denver, pero en realidad él durante 14 años fue además el decano de la Escuela de Relaciones Internacionales de la Escuela de la Universidad de Colorado. Antes de eso fue también presidente de la Universidad de New Mexico, y nosotros lo recordamos porque fue presidente de la Comisión Interamericana de Derechos Humanos en el marco de la Organización de los Estados Americanos. También ha trabajado en el Departamento de Estado, él trabajó en la Secretaría para Asuntos Interamericanos y trabajó también en el Ministerio de Defensa. Era un asistente especial del Cónsul General. Es consultor frecuente de Amnesty, de Human Rights Watch, de muchas otras organizaciones de derechos humanos. Y en las Naciones Unidas también fue muchas veces y mucho tiempo asesor legal de algunas operaciones de las Naciones Unidas. La que yo me acuerdo, porque la comentaba en clase, era la operación de Somalia, que fue un poquito antes de que yo estudiara con él en Estados Unidos. Tom Farrer ha escrito mucho y de manera muy amplia sobre cuestiones legales. Ha escrito sobre derechos humanos, sobre migraciones, sobre terrorismo, sobre, por supuesto, el funcionamiento de la Comisión Interamericana, sobre el rol de Estados Unidos a lo largo de las últimas décadas. El último libro de él es un libro que apareció justito a fin de año, es un libro sobre migraciones, se llama Migration and Integration, The Case for Liberalism with Borders. Espero que Marcelo le haga algunas preguntas sobre él. Como les digo, tiene una trayectoria muy amplia y profunda en temas de derecho internacional pública. Me gusta pensar la relación de Tom Farrer con Argentina es especial y profunda, pero yo creo que eso sería muy parroquial de mi parte. Su experiencia profesional y su vivencia personal cuando visitó la Argentina en 1978 está relatada en una hermosa y legalmente muy sofisticada pieza que el profesor Farrer tituló I Cried for You, Argentina, he llorado por ti, Argentina. Y yo diría que, por supuesto, a lo Farrer hace un análisis legal dentro de un contexto histórico, moral y ético. Así que sin mucho más para decir, bienvenido entonces, profesor Tom Farrer, una vez más, esta vez virtualmente, a la Argentina.
Much, Valentina. Thank you, Fundación Alem and Jesús Rodríguez. I am very honored, very pleased to be able to have this conversation with Professor Farrer. Last week, it was the 41st anniversary of the historic visit of the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights to Argentina in the year '79. A visit that saved so many lives because it really was a turning point in the repressive process that the country was suffering at that time. And in 1984, 85. Professor Farr was a witness at the trial of the Juntas, a trial that he calls the Argentine Nuremberg. So we would like to hear from you your reflections on the transitional justice process of Argentina, and what are your memories and your thoughts about that?
Argentina, of course, had a remarkable transitional process. A question for me, a question I wanted to really discuss with you was, how did this trial come to pass? How was it that Raúl Alfonsín, the president, how was he elected? And how did he have the authority and the power to try the leaders of the armed forces, who, after all, had dominated Argentine politics for most of the 20th century? And at the same time, I've been asking myself, what led to the horrors, the massacre, the profound massacre, which in turn led to, ultimately, to the trials. And I think that what Argentina went through is what many democratic countries go through at a certain point, which is there is a period of economic stagnation, a loss of confidence in the future, a sense that the democratic institutions have frozen, that electoral participation in the electoral process and democratic processes is ineffective to achieve the changes necessary to restart society, to create more opportunity, more justice, more fairness. And when that happens, idealists begin to think about other measures for breaking out of what they see as the frozen structure of society. And they turn sometimes to violence, to subversion. And almost invariably they fail. And why do they fail? Because the forces of the state, of reaction, of extreme conservatism, are by definition more violent, more prepared to use violence, more organized for violence than liberal forces, that is, forces which draw their inspiration from liberal ideals. That is, the personality, the psychological profile of those on the right is a different psychological profile than those who are inclined to favor justice, fairness, equality. It's a different personality, really. And so almost invariably, these efforts at change, they undermine the relatively feeble democratic institutions. It turns out that those democratic institutions are not as strong as people thought they were. And the result, even in the rare case, where the utopian reformers, or the disillusioned reformers, we might say, win, which was, let us say, Cuba, where Fidel came to power, you didn't end up with, you had a brief period of reform, but you didn't end up with freedom or liberal democracy. Because when you turn to the gun, it is those who are most adept at violence, most ready to use force, who come to the top of the organization, the insurgent organization. And so it is Stalin who ends up in charge in the Soviet Union. It is Hitler who ends up in charge in Germany. We can think of other cases. Well, it is Perón who ends up in charge in Argentina for a period of time. Well, I was thinking, take a case in a very different context, in the case of Ethiopia, when the emperor of 50 or 60 years was finally overthrown by a modernizing reformist group within the armed forces, who ultimately came to power within that junta, the most bloody-minded, the person most ready to kill his colleagues. So over the years, or let's take the recent case of Egypt. You had, for a moment, we were filled with hope that these, particularly younger people coming together, could overthrow a dictatorial system, not the worst dictatorial system by any means, but still an authoritarian system, let us say. And for a moment, they were successful, but the forces of the military, the intelligence services, and those elements of society with a stake in order proved to be more powerful. We have ended up with a much worse authoritarian system than Egypt had 10 years ago or 5 years ago. Now, to turn to Argentina, Perón was able to return because Argentina had, for years, failed to realize its human and material potential. We know, every Argentine, I think, knows that story. And frustration, deep frustration evolved, and many younger people turned to insurgency, turned to violence. And the result was to create a fear among that large majority of people who are in the center in most countries, who, yes, know things are not perfect, but want to go on having a cafecito in the morning and going to work in the afternoon and going out with the family for a nice dinner in the evening. And suddenly the society is violent. They think things are falling apart. And then they are prepared to see forces of order assume emergency powers. We have to remember that one of the voices in favor of a military coup in 1976 was a social democrat, that is, Jacobo Timmerman, the editor of a newspaper. He was among those who called for the military to intervene in politics and to overthrow the regime of Isabel Perón, who, of course, was not really governing. It was her sociopathic astrological advisor, Lopez Vega. Of course, Timmerman and other decent people never imagined that the military would introduce a reign of terror. And some people, like Timmerman, when they saw that this is what had happened, they spoke out, and then Timmerman was disappeared and tortured. But fortunately, he was sufficiently well connected so that in the end, by a split vote, the military decided to free him and expel him from the country, as you know. So, what happened? How did we get to the trial of the junta? How did the junta lose its power since it had the guns? The Argentine military it seems to me, was not completely separate from society, unlike military in, say, El Salvador or Guatemala. It had connections to human connections, family connections, historical connections, to the more Catholic, traditionalist Catholic conservative elements in the society, and officers tended to come from that strata of society. So as long as that strata of society and supported them, and as long as a great majority of people were at least pleased that the overt violence had ended, the bombings in the university and machine gun battles on Via Florida, oh, that was over. They were acquiescent, let us say, and the courts were acquiescent. The function of the commission in its famous 1979 visit was to, well, let me take one step back. How do ordinary, decent people live with massacre, systematic massacre and torture, quite widespread, going on around them? How do they continue their daily regime? How do they manage to feel at peace with themselves? Because they are basically morally decent people. They manage that by saying to themselves that, well, there is almost a civil war going on, and in such conflicts there are abusos. This is unfortunate, this is tragic, but it will end soon and we will return to normal life. You know, what they don't want to believe is that there is a large systematic campaign of torture and murder going on quietly. That's why the detention centers were clandestine. And of course, the media, with very few exceptions, was also quiescent because people wanted to believe that things weren't so bad, that there was not something sick at the very core of society. So what the commission did in 1979 was to write a report which said, things are much worse than you thought. There are not abusos. There is a systematic campaign of torture and extermination. And it is relatively indiscriminate too, because anyone who criticizes it also then becomes a victim of torture and extermination. And once ordinary people, educated people, began to feel that that was the truth. And I should add, also, they felt that stability had been restored, that the insurgent movement had been destroyed in a way, that there wasn't a problem anymore, or that the problem now was the system of torture and killing that might actually reach out to people who were not part of the insurgency and to some degree already had, then I think public opinion shifted. So we took those two elements, I think, for it to shift. It wasn't just the exposure. It was also the sense that the war was over, but it was continuing to be waged by elements of the military. When that happened, differences within the military, because there are always differences even within the senior officer class. There were true monsters, fascists, Nazis, and there were conservatives. There were the people who said, well, we have to once and for all root out the insurgency, but that they were trying to identify who were the violent people. And then there were those who said, yes, but the insurgency has its roots in the intellectuals and the liberals and the psychiatrists and the psychologists and the sociologists and the professors, and they all have to be taken away before Argentina can become what it should be. So there were those differences, and there were the differences between the services as well. So these differences that were there now became much more intense as public opinion shifted. And that led to the great mistake of playing what turned out to be the great mistake of playing the nationalist card, which was to invade the Falklands, or the Malvinas, as you wish to call them. I call them anything you want. And that turned out to be poorly planned, and it rested on what turned out to be erroneous premises. The most two premises. One, that the United States would not help the United Kingdom. It might even help Argentina, but it certainly wouldn't help the United Kingdom, because after all, Argentina was cooperating with the United States in its repression of revolutionary forces in Central America. And there were ties between elements of the conservative class in America and the Argentine military. The second premise was that the British would not mount a very expensive and precarious military operation to recapture the Malvinas. So that's, in other words, that the Argentine military would create a fait accompli, and the British would accept facts on the ground, namely that they had lost it. And in international circles, they would say, well, this is really just an act of restoring the body of the nation, just as the Chinese today are saying we must have Taiwan because the nation is not complete. The body of the nation is not complete, which means distrust all biological metaphors. So when that disaster really completed the process of what we might call, I think in Spanish you call it how do you say it? To deprive of prestige, despreciado. There is a desprestigiado. To destroy the prestige of something. And so the military prestige was unwinding, it was eroding quickly, but then the failure in the Malvinas, that ended it. So there was a total breakdown of their prestige, of their support base in the civilian population, and the price that society had paid for the restoration of order became more apparent and understood, widely understood. And that, I think, is what led to the election of Alfonsín, who said, I will restore decency, justice. We have order already, but it is a malign order. It is a malevolent order, but we now have to move to establish a just order. And we must cut out the cancer which grew as a consequence of the previous disorder. And people responded to that message, and he got a mandate. And meanwhile, the military had gone back to the barracks. There were internal disarray, bitterness, because the power of the military is not the gun, it's unity. Or it takes the two. the gun, and unity. Unity breaks down, they can turn the guns on each other. So to restore unity, you have to go back to the barracks. And at least for the time, accept the judgment of the Argentine people, because they elected a party which normally they would never elect. So that meant a mandate. So Alfonsín and they were fortunate that a man as decent as Alfonsín should be available at that moment, because I think he was I came to know him a bit. In fact, when I was president of the University of New Mexico, I arranged to give him an honorary degree. So that's how I came to know, and I knew a few people who were close to him. So I have every reason to believe that he was a really honorable man who had a sense of the moment, a sense of what needed to be done, and had the courage to do it because it was a risk. And he did it carefully. And he was fortunate to have an excellent judge, D'Alessio, again, a man of great character, a man of the center, really, a man who belonged to the jockey club, you know. You could say an impeccable man in that sense, even to conservative elements in society, as the chief judge. I also came to know him in later years, but not when I testified at the trial. And you had an outstanding prosecutor. So you had, by chance perhaps, the right people in place. And then the process had an aura of justice about it. And that was because you had a prosecutor who was presenting evidence. People had a sense of what a good legal process can look like, what a fair legal process could look like. Even though the lawyers for the junta members, with one exception, were all appointed because the junta members said this trial is illegitimate and therefore we will not appoint lawyers. There was one exception. The lawyers did try and defend their clients. So you had a real adversary process. And I think this was an effort to restore institutionality to Argentine society, to government. We are in the United States threatened by a president who hungers for power, who is not a Democrat by instinct, is an authoritarian by instinct, feels warm feelings for other authoritarians, but he is inhibited by the institutions that have been built up over more than 200 years. So Alfonsín's contribution to Argentine society was to show that institutions matter, judicial institutions and prosecutorial institutions. So that was what was important. And of course, it confirmed, in laying out the evidence, it confirmed what had happened. It confirmed the report of the commission and preserved a record of what Argentina had gone through, a record for future generations. And I was happy to be able to participate in that process. So I've spoken too much, but you have my views for what they are worth.
This has been wonderful. Thank you so much. You have written recently on sovereignty, nationalism, and human rights, and with a special focus on the problem of immigration. I want to ask you about that a bit. This is an interesting topic from the South. First, as you may know, Argentina is an open borders country. Its constitution invites anyone wanting to live in the Argentine soil and assigning them the same rights as the nationals, right? We also have a great problem of forced migration in the case of the Venezuelans. 3 or 4 million Venezuelans are now living in different parts of Latin America. And in some countries like Colombia, this has created some societal resistance. It's very interesting that your view about immigration, you favor a more open policy regarding borders internationally, and much open borders in the case of refugees. You combine reasons of humanity and reasons of justice, and this has the potential to attract the support of different political and philosophical perspectives. Do you think that in order to address and consider some of your proposals, it would be necessary to have a global effort in place? Do you envision an international agreement on the subject of immigration?
No. No, I don't. After all, an effort was made within the past year, and it was unsuccessful. Actually, I think you emphasize my liberal instincts on the issue of migration, but understate my conservative instincts. So let me clarify my position.
Sorry
Actually,
about that.
I'm a sort of a mix of John Stuart Mill and Edmund Burke there. I recognize that. In what sense am I a conservative, or do I at least understand the conservative position? I think Burke recognized the power of legacy, the power of history, that when you make changes to, this comes back to a point I made earlier, when you try to or allow radical change to occur, there will be pushback. And the pushback may destroy the very institutions which a liberal society has built over a long period of time. Of course, Burke was not defending liberal institutions, because the United Kingdom in the time of the French Revolution was not a very liberal place, but it was a place with some debido proceso, some sense of law and maybe not fairness, but at least of order, of a non-authoritarian, not totally brutal order. But I'm much more of a liberal, to be sure, than I am a conservative. But I understand, let's say I understand, or I think I understand, the fragility, the delicateness of liberalism and human rights, of the values that inspire human rights. Because human rights is an expression of deeper values, of a sense of the moral equality and dignity of all people. Human rights is an institutionalization or an instrumentalization of that premise, which is more than a premise, it's an emotional conviction. Without that emotional conviction, the particulars of human rights, the covenants, all the details, they would be lifeless, you know. Now, when I started thinking about the issue of migration, one of the first things I did was look at the demographics of the world. And what I saw was the huge growth that was occurring, that had occurred and was going to continue to occur, at least for the next 30 years, in parts of the world which were unable to provide jobs for emerging generations. Take the case of the Middle East, for example, Middle East and North Africa. In 1950, there were only about 93 million people living in that whole area. By today, there are 380 million people living in that area. And if you just project from today, even though the birth rate is declining, you have this huge overhang resulting from the very rapid demographic growth over the prior 70 years. By 2050, you will have maybe 650 million people living in the Middle East and North Africa. And much of the society, many people are already living in the informal sector. They don't have regular jobs, and they have no prospect of regular jobs or jobs. And the state sector is already swollen. States can't keep hiring people. That's how they have been maintaining stability in many countries in the Middle East. Well, stability is broken down, is breaking down before our eyes. Because the state is so swollen, because there are people cannot marry. They're living at home. Only in Egypt, only the strength of the family really keeps society going. Because the young people enter the labor market, but there's nothing for them in the labor market. Africa, growth is faster still. Nigeria has 180 million people today. They'll have 500 million in 2050. It's only 30 years away. All over Africa, you find this enormous growth rate. So I ask myself, where are these young people going to go? And they will try to go, or many will will try to go to rich countries, of course, where there is opportunity. Now, my idealistic side says we should not, it would be unfair for people's opportunity to be a result of the accident of birth, of where you are born. In the feudal period, if you were born a peasant, you stayed a peasant. If you were lucky enough to be born an aristocrat, a baron, or a duke, you stayed a duke. So your chance in life was a result of birth in a particular class. Well, today, as one moral theorist says, you have a very similar system, except now, instead of it being a question of class, it's a question of geography. If you are born in Lagos, your life chances are very poor. If you're born in Louisville or in Denver, your life chances are pretty good. And doesn't that seem unfair if you believe in the equal dignity of all people? So at the level of idealism, of theory, of moral theory, it's very hard to say, well, we have a good life here and we need some people, because most of the rich countries are not replacing themselves demographically. You need 2.1 live births per mother, and you don't have it. In Spain, in Italy, it's about 1.3. Germany is not much higher than that. So our society, and Japan, it's worst of all, about 1.1. So our societies are dwindling, and getting older. So Japan shows what happens when you have this demographic stagnation, worse than stagnation. You have for what, 20 years or more, had a completely stagnant economy in Japan. And the desperate efforts to change that have been unsuccessful. Japan has the highest level of public debt, I think, in the world, because they've been trying to stimulate the economy in the face of a declining population, and they cannot do it. But they have been reluctant to allow immigration. So Japan tells us where the future is unless we have more people coming into the country. So we do need migration. If you want, otherwise, what you are going to get in countries is more and more tension, generational tension, because younger people will be working and they will be paying for the pensions and the care of the retired. And that you can also see the beginnings of generational tension, but it will intensify dramatically over the next 30 years. So there's a strong instrumental case for migration. Never mind the idealistic case, put that to one side. And that's why I think that you can build a coalition, and there is a coalition in the United States for migration, but controlled migration, a sense of selective migration. Because if you have, remember, I think your constitutional provision for open borders goes back to the 19th century, if I remember correctly. 1853.
Yes. 1853, yes.
Argentina was a very large country with vast resources and relatively small population. You wanted to populate the country. So it was very natural, maybe idealistic, but it was also very pragmatic. We want people to come. And they came from Spain, well, more from Spain, and then many came from Italy and from other places too. So it made sense. It was practical and it satisfied idealistic views. That was good. But
Professor, there was also a little bit of racism, because the Constitution also said that the Congress should promote European immigration.
Ah, yes. I forgot that, or I didn't know that, actually. Now, we could spend several hours talking about this phenomenon of racial identification. That is, people banding together on the basis of pigmentation. In a way, it sounds weird that should be an important source of identity, whether you have a little darker or much darker or pale or pinkish or tawny skin. And if in history, there's a very fine book called Racism, A Short History by a brilliant American historian, George Frederickson, in which he shows that there's nothing entirely consistent about this, that it's changed over centuries if you go back far enough, and that we have evolved, unfortunately, into strong racial identity. That is, of course, we all have multiple identities, family and clan, and our state and our soccer team, and you name it. We have many identities. But this pigmentation identity, defined in many ways. In South Africa, because they wanted Japanese investment, they defined Japanese as white. It's something very arbitrary about not very, it's arbitrary. This racial, this, I call it pigmentational identification, because that's what it is. But it's there. And so if you are a liberal concerned with public policy, you say, we have a certain portion of the population, fortunately a minority, who have this strong sense of pigmentational identity and an instinctive fear or dislike of people with a different pigmentation. So how do we maintain our liberal democratic institutions when we are facing, when this is an element of society? We have to deal with it. Thinking of Europe, European countries, and the US, racism, I'll use the word now, but instead of pigmentational, because it's a bigger word, harder to say, it exists, or it becomes more intense, or it attracts more people in periods, I believe, of instability, a period of insecurity, and a very rapid change. Insecurity, not only economic insecurity, but societal insecurity, personal identity insecurity. People have lived a certain way, they have every society, every group in society has its customary practices, which it's comfortable with, and its view of the world, its view of hierarchies, its view of opportunities, and suddenly everything seems to be melting. So a number of factors converge. So in the United States, the deindustrialization of the country has played a very important role in, I think, intensifying racialism. No, it had roots going back, of course, to the beginning of American society and the civil and the whole difference between North and South and the racist views that evolved or that were there going back to the very founding of the country. But the society evolved in many ways. But now in American society today, you see this white identity movement emerging, but you see it also appearing in Europe. Because Europe is also undergoing deindustrialization. Industry used to be a basis for a secure middle-class existence. Our steel workers, our automobile workers, people who worked in the subsidiary industries, they were often unionized. They had lower middle to middle class salaries. They had houses, cars, vacations, and in a relatively short period of time, these industries shrank radically. And it is not just a question of suddenly experiencing economic uncertainty and a reduction in salary and opportunity. It's also that part of our identity is our work. And when your work goes, a part of your identity, it comes into question. When you can't find a good job, when you go from making $30 an hour to working at McDonald's for $9 an hour, your identity is threatened as a person. This is occurring. So we get back to the question of migration. My basic thesis was that the kind of very rapid change or appearance of change resulting, for example, from the arrival of over 1 million people claiming refugee status in Germany in 2015 to 2016 was disturbing to many people. It just made them feel, what's happening? But that feeling was, they were already feeling uneasy about changes in society. We haven't talked about cultural changes. We haven't talked about the fact that in 20 years, now I'll just look at the United States. In 20 years, we went from a large majority of the population totally opposed to gay marriage to a large majority of the population favoring gay marriage. We have had very profound cultural shifts in the United States and in Europe as well. So you have cultural shifts, you have economic shifts. This creates a sense of uneasiness among a significant portion of the population. Now, some part of the population is, well, for want of a better word, cosmopolitan. They like change, they're comfortable with change, diversity. Usually these are people who are very well educated and have very good job prospects or already have good jobs. And they can enjoy diversity. They know who they are, their jobs are not at risk. But portions of the population do not share this feeling, do not share this sensation. They have a feeling that they are like a big block of ice on the highway in the summer, or that the society, as it's melting, their inheritance, their cultural inheritance, their status inheritance is melting before their eyes. So we have to proceed cautiously. That's really what I'm saying. We who believe in liberal democracy, in the institutions which Alfonsín sought to strengthen, the trial being one of the ways of strengthening it, we who believe in this, in the importance of democratic institutions, knowing that all societies are imperfect, that we need to improve, but without those institutions, we won't improve. When it comes to the issue of migration, we say we must do it in a way which commands majority support. And we must not do it clandestinely. There must be a process of consultation with the society. And the way you consult with a large society is through the electoral process. So the issue of migration should be brought out, should be part of the platform, should be discussed at the political level, so that ordinary people say, how did we suddenly have this large migration? How do we have all of these people here? I don't remember voting in favor of this large migration. In the case of the United States, we had for a long time, very porous borders. And we had a coalition supporting porous borders. We had farmers, farm workers. We had businesses who wanted more labor is good for business. More labor is good for capital. And you had liberals who said we should welcome people in need who come here, whether they come as refugees or just come to build a better life, whatever the reason. So you had a mixture of liberal idealists and conservative owners of capital. And then increasingly, you had the diaspora, that is, as people came in and became citizens and became part of American society, many wanted then to bring in uncles and aunts and cousins. And so that was another element of, let us say, the electoral coalition favoring large-scale immigration. And the polls indicate that there is still a majority in the United States for pretty substantial migration. as a majority. But there is not support for undocumented immigration. So people want to, particularly in this period of transition, many people want a sense of being of a society that is orderly, that is where they are, through their representatives, through the state, in control, that they are making the decision as to who may enter. And so I think in defense of liberal institutions, you need to limit undocumented immigration. That has nothing to do with how much migration you want. You may favor large-scale migration, but you want it to be documented. And then you get into a discussion of what measures are you willing to take, or should you take, and must you take if you want to limit undocumented migration. And the last chapter of my book is an effort to set out the measures which I think are necessary. And I should add that foreign aid to try to make poor societies wealthier so that fewer people will want to migrate is clearly not the answer. Because the people who migrate from poorer societies are not the poorest, not the most desperately in need, because they are people living day to day. They don't have the money to pay for people movers. It is only people who are a bit wealthier. They're not wealthy, but maybe the extended family unites, puts together enough money so they can pay the people smugglers to smuggle a member of the family to Germany or the United States or Italy, and then begin the process of hopefully integrating in that society, and then more people can come. So there are reasons to give foreign assistance, but that's not one of them. So that's basically my position, that I am opposed to undocumented migration, and I'm opposed to it not for moral reasons, but for liberal instrumentalist reasons. One of them is that if undocumented migration is high and is resented and noticed, it does undermine to some degree the rule of law, the sense of law operating. When you have, just as prohibition in the United States, which many people ignored, many people wanted to continue drinking. So what happened? A tremendous illegal society emerged. This is when the mafias, the organized crime groups, became much more powerful as a consequence of that period. The rule of law was deeply undermined by having laws that were almost openly ignored, right? So I think it is unwise if you believe that the rule of law is fragile or brittle, that you have a body of law, migration law, which is widely ignored. It isn't today, but it was for a long time. So that summarizes my position. It's what I'd call an instrumental defense of liberal democratic society. Excuse me.
No problem.
So have I answered your question, perhaps at excessive length?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. We are running out of time, but I want to leave you the last words. Maybe I'm curious what you think about the relation between populism, which emerges constantly in these problems about immigration in Europe and elsewhere. The conflict between populism and liberal democracy and human rights, or whatever you want to say to close this conversation.
We have to ask ourselves, what is populism? Because it's used in different ways, but I think there is a core idea behind our various uses. It is an appeal to people who feel powerless, who feel that there is an elite, there are forces out there which are regulating their life, the life of ordinary people, people who are dissatisfied with their life because they have lost their sense of social mobility or of a relatively elevated status, because groups that were below them have now risen to their same level or even above them, who feel condescended to. Part of the problem is that as society becomes, as technology evolves, as we develop a society in which learning is more technical, knowledge is more and more important, people who don't have that technical knowledge are more and more cut off from opportunity. And I guess what I'm talking about two phenomena, but they intersect, I believe. One is the phenomenon of the emergence of a large cosmopolitan elite, people who are highly educated, who travel widely, are comfortable in a globalized world. But they are also people who, because of their high education and because of the changes in the political economy, have great opportunity of comfortable lives and are more separated and feel justified in their comfort and their wealth because they have achieved it through what they see as merit. That is, they were educated and they worked hard, and that's why they are wealthy. So when you no longer have status defined by inheritance, by legacy, as in a very class-ordered society like Britain, although Britain has changed. Let's say Britain 50 years ago, when, well, you were born to be in the upper class or the upper middle or the middle or the lower or the working class. And that was the luck of birth. When you get into a meritocratic society, the people who are successful say, we are successful because we deserve to be successful. We earned this. I am a billionaire because I studied hard, I had good ideas, I innovated, I'm a billionaire, I deserve it. So I think there's a greater sense of separation from people who are successful from people who are less successful. Now, numbers may play a role. Our societies are much larger. And there may be an inevitable, and they're more complicated. We have many more people. Numbers may matter, but we have much more complicated societies. We have rules and we have regulations. If you want to start a business, you have to dot various I's and cross various T's, and you have to pay your taxes and to the state level and the local level. Society gets more and more complicated, and people who don't have lawyers and don't understand all these complexities feel, I think, more and more frustrated. There once was a simple society, and what happened to that simple society where I felt comfortable and people look for reasons for their dissatisfactions. And a very comforting reason is that it is not fate, or it is not forces beyond the control of us, just world historical forces like storms. It is people, other people, groups of people. They are the cause of our frustrations. And then you have demagogues who come along and say, you're right. And they say, these are the people, whether they be the Jews or the liberals or whatever group is, particularly a group which seems successful, which maybe wasn't successful before it moved up in society. They say, well, this is the reason that you are not achieving what you would like to achieve. This is what I see as populism. So left populism said the bad people are the capitalists. And we get rid of the capitalists. This was Lenin. We get rid of the capitalists, and then things will be good. Well, the more common case is the right demagogue who says, and they pick out the vulnerable groups. It is homosexuals. There's a homosexual conspiracy. There's a Jewish conspiracy. There's Indian, it depends on the society, particularly the vulnerable groups, and particularly where they have improved their status over time. That's what I call populism. Populism is a political movement which defines good people or real people it has increasingly a nationalist tinge. You say real Americans and those people. They're not real Americans. They're not real Germans. Just as in the Inquisition, you said these Morenos, they pretend to be Catholic, but actually they're Jews, you say. And then that's populism. And it has appeal in this kind of period in which we are in Europe, in America, and it's always had appeal in Latin America because Latin America has not realized its potential. It's for a whole complex of reasons, which we'd have to spend a big conference discussing over a month or so, which would be fun to do, but regrettably we can't do it today. But that's the appeal of populism. The other. Without the other, there is no populism. That's my view of populism. And for all the reasons that we discussed earlier, that is the change in the political economy, the arrival of meritocracy, the instability, and yes, the changes in society and the changes in culture, the rapid changes in culture. All of this contribute to a sense of uneasiness, and many people feel uncomfortable with that. And so along comes a man like Donald Trump, who senses this and finds the right words, the right memes, to use a contemporary word, to mobilize this frustration and turn it into focused anger. And then you have a very ugly populism, which we must struggle against. That's all. It's an unending struggle. Liberalism is not the default drive. It's not the default in politics. It is, we must be as passionate and as hard-headed and as tough as our opponents.
I fully agree, and thank you so much, Professor. I hope we can all meet sometime in Buenos Aires.
Ah, that would be my pleasure. Believe me, I love Buenos Aires. Is always on my bucket list. No matter how many times I go, I want to go again.
Valentina?
Yes, thank you so much, Professor Farrer. Thank you so much for your time. You have been so generous with your time and with your ideas, and it has been really the first part of your speech, particularly. I don't know you, Marcelo, that are also from the Radical Party, has reminded us about our mandate. Alfonsín had a mandate with the Junta trial, and now we have a mandate to perform. And I was wondering, while Professor Farrer talked, which one was it? And I thought, I don't know if it happened to you, that you thought automatically about corruption, the importance that the Junta trial, you know, the idea of process, adversarial process, the guarantees, but the necessity that we have to count on evidence for the society to get to know what happened and document it. So it was very inspirational, actually, in real, actual and political terms. And then the other part of the speech, that was the international law speech as well, I love it too, actually. So thank you for other reasons. So thank you so much, Professor Farrer, again, and I hope that really we will have you here in Buenos Aires again, once more, presentially.
It would be a great pleasure for me, and I hope I live long enough. I intend to, just for that purpose, if no other.
Nice. Take care of you.
Ciao, ciao to all of you. Good luck. And we must talk again. We can talk
for sure.
Individually.
Yeah, for sure.
Bye-bye.
Take care.